Today I'm going to talk about two poems, one being The Lady's Dressing Room by Jonathan Swift, which will be the centerpiece of today's presentation, and the other being the matching answer poem by Lady Montagu, called The Reasons That Induced Dr. Swift. Here you can see the structure of today's presentation. First, we are going to take a look at the overall themes, then a closer look at the authors, two short summaries, some interpretations, and lastly, the sources. First up, we have the different themes of the poems. As both are so closely related to each other, one being the answer poem to the other, only naturally the themes will overlap. Both poems are very much concerned with gender as well as political and social satire. During my research, I had two key questions in mind. What was Swift's motivation to write The Lady's Dressing Room? And secondly, is it strongly misogynistic or just misunderstood? Let's take a look at Jonathan Swift. He was born on the last day of November in 1667 in Dublin, Ireland, where he also died on October 19th, 745. Despite originally publishing all of his works either anonymously or under different names, he is still to this day a very well-known author in the realm of satire. He's even said to be a master of satire. With his witty and iconic way of writing, loaded with scatological humor, which is essentially making fun of defecation, urine, etc., Swift often becomes the target of fellow authors such as his opponent, Lady Montagu. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was born on May 15th in 1689 in London, and also died there on August 21st, 762. She was an aristocrat, a writer, poet, as well as a feminist. She was known for her eloquent and eccentric way of writing, with a special talent to convey a matter convincingly but still comedic. Even though she died about 300 years ago, the issues she had to deal with are still relevant till this day. One of them being prejudice against female writers. Another one being an arranged marriage that her father tried to push her into, but she resisted and eloped with an acquaintance of hers. And lastly, sexism in every aspect. Comparing these authors, there are some overall similarities and differences that can be made. A similarity would be that both of them have a very humorous way to express serious problems of the 18th century. Further, both poems make fun of gender stereotypes at that time. The difference would be that Lady Montagu was a very convinced feminist, whereas The Lady's Dressing Room still has some hints of misogynism. Lastly, Swift's poem got way more recognition than the answer poem, regarding that male authors were much more appreciated back then. Let's take a look at the summary. The Lady's Dressing Room can be overall departed in three main parts. First, the introduction. Strephon sneaks into his lover Celia's dressing room. Secondly, the plot. Entering her dressing room, he is met with a smelly room. Instead of leaving right away, he decides to rummage around her belongings. From that point on, he finds various objects that evoke the feeling of disgust within him. Lastly, Strephon is struck by an epiphany. His illusions of women, especially Celia, being immaculate and perfect goddesses, are replaced by the feeling of repulsiveness when thinking about women. Any thought A dirty smock appeared beneath the armpits, well besmeared. Strephon the rogue displayed it white and turned it round on every side. In such a case, few words are best, and Strephon bids us guess the rest, but swears how dumbly the men lie in calling Celia sweet and cleanly. This quote, describing Celia's inventory that Strephon is met with, is a very good example of showing how Swift uses language to paint a picture in the reader's minds. The very vivid language evokes this imagery and causes the reader to find themselves in the dressing room surrounded by the filth that is described. So now let's move on to the summary of the reasons that induced Dr. Swift by Lady Montagu. The Doctor, nameholder for Jonathan Swift, as can be seen in the title, is the protagonist who tries to pursue a whore. After her services, he starts to experience impotence. He then blames her for that and wants his money back. The whore doesn't give in and reasons that his old age might be to blame for impotence. Angered by this insult, the Doctor swears, "I'll so describe your dressing room, the very Irish shall not come." Analyzing the poem, there's no doubt that Montagu is actively trying to attack Swift. Mentioning the very Irish is a very obvious hint to Swift's nationality, as well as mentioning the dressing room is a key to Swift's work, The Lady's Dressing Room. Topping this with naming the protagonist Dr. Swift in the title makes it obvious that Lady Montagu is implicating that Swift is suffering under sexual frustration as well as impotence. Lastly, we have the interpretation. I've worked out 3 different types of interpretation that might be suitable for the lady's dressing room. The first one being men shall not snoop around a lady's dressing room. This one seems very obvious, but our character, Strephon, doesn't seem to get it. If it's a lady or not, you should not go around anyone's private place and act offended once you find something that doesn't align with your likings. Secondly, we have the poem makes fun of women. Obviously the most misogynistic one, but it could mean that the poem makes fun of women who pretend to be perfect and men actually buying into that. So it's not purely against women, but they are obviously the main actor. Lastly, we have women try to match unrealistic expectations to impress men. Trying to be perfect can often result in bad blood between women, trying to trump each other and who may be more beautiful. Especially back in the day, in the 18th century, when women's appearance determined their whole future in finding a suitor, this may be a more serious reason to get into fights. The right way to attract a husband was to show off money in form of elegant gowns, jewelry, and being pretty. Men wanted to marry rich, to rise in society and get richer. This strongly polarized between lower class and upper class, since members of higher society allowed themselves to invest more into their looks and were therefore treated in a more respected way. Drawing out this obsession with a woman's appearance and the ugliness that is hidden by makeup and hours in the dressing room, Swift paints out not only women's vanity but also men's. Since Strephon is disgusted by his lover Celia after he sees the dressing room, the question arises whether or not there's true sympathy between them, or if Strephon only wanted money because Celia is of the upper class, which is evident in her having a maid called Betty. If I had to decide, I would go with the last interpretation because I think that that's the most fitting one. In my opinion, there's still some hints of misogynism which don't sit well with me, and I agree with Lady Montagu on calling Swift out for that, But at the same time, I think that it's a good message for men to not always expect the perfectionism and to believe that women are natural goddesses. So I think that Swift did a well job on that front. Thanks a bunch for listening. I hope you learned something.